By 10 o'clock, Ashford Manor already shone as though every candle in England had been brought there. Footmen carried silver trays through glittering corridors, maids hurried between guest chambers with fresh linen. In the great dining room, crystal caught the morning light and scattered it across walls lined with portraits of Ashford dukes. At the centre of everything stood Lady Vivian Ashford. She adjusted the white roses beneath the mantel, checked the seating cards, corrected a misplaced dessert spoon, and quietly changed the music programme when she learned an elderly guest disliked loud overtures. She knew which lord required a cushion for his injured back, which lady preferred weak tea, and which political rivals must never be seated together. Vivienne had already prevented every difficulty before it appeared. "His Grace's gatherings are always flawless," one visiting baroness remarked as servants arranged flowers in the entrance hall. Vivienne smiled gently. "The household works very hard." For 12 years, Ashford Manor's grandest occasions had depended upon her care. Yet when the guests arrived, she was rarely there to receive them. Near sunset, the first carriage appeared beyond the iron gates. Vivienne stood beneath the chandelier, wearing a pale blue gown William had once said suited her. She had chosen it foolishly, perhaps, because some small part of her still hoped this evening might be different. William approached from the library composed in his formal evening clothes. He looked around the hall, taking in the flowers, servants, and perfect order. "Everything is excellent," he said. "I am glad." He stepped closer and gently straightened the ribbon at her shoulder. The tenderness of the gesture made what followed hurt more. "Leave before my guests arrive," he whispered. Vivienne looked toward the approaching carriage. Of course. There was no argument. There had not been one for years. The first time he asked her to remain upstairs, he had called the dinner politically delicate. The next time, a visiting duchess supposedly found Vivienne too quiet. Later came parliamentary guests, royal acquaintances, and men whose approval William believed essential. Each exclusion had been softened by polite words. "Rest tonight. Perhaps next time. You would not enjoy it." Gradually, Vivienne stopped preparing gowns for herself. She still arranged every gathering, then disappeared before anyone could see who had made it possible. She returned to her rooms, removed the pale blue gown, and folded it carefully across the bed. From the wardrobe she took a plain travelling dress and a dark cloak. Her bag was already packed. It contained little: 2 books, a brush, several letters, and enough clothing for a few days. On the dressing table she placed her wedding ring. For a moment her fingers rested beside it. Then she left without a farewell. She moved through the servants' corridor as music began in the ballroom. Mrs. Edith Collins saw her near the kitchen stairs and noticed the small bag. "Your Grace?" Vivienne paused. Edith's face held the concern of someone who had witnessed too many quiet departures. "Will you return after dinner?" Vivienne gave the same soft smile she had offered William. "Do not let the soup cool." Before Edith could answer, Vivienne stepped through the servants' entrance and disappeared into the evening. By midnight, the gathering was being praised as Ashford Manor's finest. William accepted compliments with practised ease. He assumed Vivienne would return when the last carriage departed, as she always had. In the morning he found her breakfast tray untouched outside her sitting room. He told himself she was sleeping. At noon the tray remained there. By evening unease drew him inside. The room was perfectly ordered. No drawers had been pulled open. No letter waited upon the desk. Her favourite shawl was gone, and her wedding ring lay alone upon the dressing table. William stared at it for a long time before calling her name, though he already knew the room was empty. Servants searched the gardens, chapel, stables, and village road. No one had seen which direction she took. William sent riders to nearby stations and messages to every family acquaintance he could recall. He expected news before nightfall. None came. One day became 3. 3 became 7. Ashford Manor did not collapse dramatically. It simply began failing in small, revealing ways. A tenant's urgent request remained unanswered because William had never known Vivian reviewed such letters each morning. A widow arrived for an allowance no steward remembered approving. Guest chambers were prepared incorrectly. Charitable accounts went unsigned. The youngest kitchen maid burst into tears because the Duchess was no longer there to quietly defend her mistakes. William discovered that responsibilities he believed belonged to the estate had belonged, in truth, to his wife. Her Grace handled these matters personally, Mr. Thomas Mercer explained as he placed a growing stack of petitions upon William's desk. "For how long?" William asked. "For as long as I have served here." Edith stood near the door, her hands folded tightly. "Everyone admired your Grace," she said carefully, "but everyone loved the Duchess." The words followed William into Vivian's sitting room that night. He began searching not for clues to her destination, but for some explanation of how she had lived beside him, while becoming so absent from his life. Inside a cabinet beneath her writing desk, Edith discovered a carved wooden box. William opened it. Dozens of invitations lay inside, arranged by year. Garden parties, concerts, charity galas, royal receptions. Every envelope bore Vivienne's name. Most had never been opened. Attached to them were brief notes in William's own handwriting. "It will be easier if you stay home. This dinner is politically delicate. Perhaps next time." He read each sentence with growing horror. 12 years of polite rejection rested in his hands. At the bottom lay the final invitation addressed to both the Duke and Duchess for that evening's gathering. William opened it slowly. A smaller paper slipped free. On it, in Vivian's careful handwriting, were 6 words. "I finally did as you asked." William read the note again, then once more, as though the words might change if he stared at them long enough. "I finally did as you asked." There was no accusation in the neat handwriting, no bitterness, no attempt to make him suffer. That quietness frightened him more than anger ever could have. He lowered himself into the chair beside Vivian's writing desk, the carved box still open before him. 12 years of invitations lay carefully tied with faded ribbons. Each represented an evening she might have shared beside him. Each carried one of his own polite excuses, asking her to remain unseen. Edith stood silently near the doorway. "She kept everyone," William murmured. "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" Edith's eyes filled with sadness. "Because every time you wrote, 'perhaps next time,' she believed there would be one." The words settled heavily over the room. William dismissed everyone and remained there until dawn. For the first time since Vivienne had disappeared, he stopped asking where she had gone and began asking who she had become while living beside him. The following morning, he opened the first drawer of her writing desk. Inside lay neatly arranged journals, one for nearly every year of their marriage. He hesitated before lifting the oldest volume. It felt like opening a conversation he should have listened to years earlier. The first pages made him smile through tears. Vivienne described their first Christmas together, her excitement at learning the traditions of Ashford Manor, and her hope that each season would bring them closer. She wrote warmly of William's kindness, his intelligence, and the pride she felt watching him lead the estate. Every difficult evening ended with optimism. "Perhaps next dinner we shall greet the guests together." Perhaps next season politics will be less demanding. Perhaps he simply worries I become tired. There was never resentment, only hope. As the journals continued, the hopeful entries slowly changed. He apologized again today. I know he means well. He promised the next reception would be different. The blue gown remained in the wardrobe once more. William closed his eyes. He remembered the blue gown. He had complimented it years earlier, then asked her not to wear it because influential ministers were attending. The memory had seemed insignificant then. Now it felt unbearable. The final journal rested beneath the others. Its pages grew shorter. The hopeful language became quieter. One entry read, "He looked relieved when I agreed not to attend." Another simply said, "I believe I make life easier by disappearing." William could scarcely breathe. Near the end he found the last, completed page. Perhaps he never noticed I disappeared because I had already become invisible. He pressed the journal against his chest as grief overcame him. He had believed himself a loving husband, yet the woman who defended him even in her private thoughts had slowly come to believe she no longer belonged beside him. Downstairs, Ashford Manor continued revealing truths he had never bothered to see. Thomas Mercer brought tenant letters that always bore Vivian's notes in the margins, recommending assistance for struggling families. Charitable accounts carried her careful handwriting approving food deliveries and school books for village children. Widows arrived asking whether the Duchess was recovering because she had never once forgotten their birthdays. Young servants admitted they had remained at Ashford Manor only because Lady Vivian treated them with patience when others would have dismissed them. We thought she had simply gone to visit a friend. One kitchen maid confessed through tears. She always smiled, Your Grace. We never imagined she was unhappy. William realized that almost every kindness for which Ashford Manor was praised had quietly begun with Vivian. The respect he enjoyed as Duke had been strengthened every day by the compassion of a wife he repeatedly asked to leave the room. He cancelled every dinner, every parliamentary engagement, every invitation waiting upon his desk. The ballroom was closed, musicians dismissed, visiting politicians received polite refusals. Society whispered that the Duke had become strangely withdrawn. William no longer cared. His reputation had once governed every decision. Now it mattered less than finding the woman whose absence had revealed the emptiness of everything else. Far from Ashford Manor, Rosemere House welcomed each morning without ceremony. Lady Charlotte Pembroke never questioned Vivian's decision to come. She simply embraced her at the front door on the night she arrived and prepared tea beside the library fire. Days became weeks. Vivian gradually exchanged silence for conversation. Charlotte invited her to sit at the head of the dinner table, where every guest naturally turned toward her. The first evening Vivian hesitated. "Surely you should sit there," Charlotte smiled. "This is my home. I choose where my friends belong." Vivian slowly took the seat, uncertain why such a simple kindness felt almost overwhelming. At Rosemere she walked through gardens without watching the clock. She laughed with village children who cared nothing for titles. She read stories aloud beneath ancient oak trees. No one ever asked her to disappear before visitors arrived. She began remembering the woman she had been before years of quiet compromise convinced her she belonged in the background. Months later, Thomas quietly entered William's study, carrying a letter. "Lady Charlotte Pembroke has been seen hosting reading afternoons for village children," he said carefully. "Her Grace is believed to be there." William's heart quickened. The following afternoon he travelled alone to Rosemere House. He stopped beneath tall beech trees overlooking the village green. There she was. Vivienne sat upon a blanket surrounded by laughing children, holding an open book while sunlight danced across her face. She smiled freely, a smile he had not seen in years because he had forgotten how rarely she had reason to use it. Charlotte sat nearby sewing peacefully, watching with quiet satisfaction. William took one step forward, then he stopped. He realized that approaching her now would once again place his longing above her peace. She had finally found a place where no one expected her to become smaller. He could not be the man who interrupted that healing. Without announcing himself, he quietly returned to Ashford Manor. From that day forward, his search changed. He no longer searched for Vivienne to bring her home. He began changing the home itself. Her portrait returned to the entrance hall and every public room where it had quietly disappeared over the years. He personally attended the charities she had founded, learning the names of people she had supported without recognition. He insisted every official invitation bear both their names, though he sent none to Rosemere. He would not ask her to return until Ashford Manor became worthy of welcoming her. Seasons passed. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a single envelope arrived at Rosemere House. Charlotte placed it silently beside Vivienne's teacup. Vivienne recognized William's handwriting immediately. She unfolded the paper. Inside was only one sentence. Ashford Manor will never again ask you to leave. She read it twice, then carefully folded the letter and rested it in her lap without speaking. Vivienne held William's letter for a long time after Charlotte quietly left the room. There were no promises written upon the page, no desperate pleas, no explanation for 12 years of silence, only a single sentence. Ashford Manor will never again ask you to leave. She folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the same book she had been reading to the village children that morning. Charlotte returned carrying fresh tea and noticed the peaceful expression upon her friend's face. "Will you answer?" she asked gently. Vivienne looked through the window where children were chasing one another across the autumn grass. "Not yet," she replied softly. "For the first time, I do not feel hurried." Charlotte smiled. "Then perhaps that is your answer for today." The seasons continued changing. William never wrote another letter asking Vivienne to return. He understood that another invitation would become another expectation, and expectations had already stolen too many years from their marriage. Instead, he quietly continued transforming Ashford Manor. He insisted every servant enter through the front hall during household celebrations rather than hidden corridors. He restored Vivienne's portrait to the entrance gallery where every visitor first arrived. Whenever charitable committees visited the estate, he personally introduced the schools, hospitals, and relief funds as the Duchess's work rather than his own. "These were always her ideas," he would say simply. "I merely failed to notice how much they mattered." Reverend Jonathan Hale watched these changes with cautious approval. One afternoon, William asked whether true forgiveness was still possible. The Reverend answered thoughtfully, "Remorse grieves over yesterday, repentance changes tomorrow. Only time reveals the difference." William accepted the words without argument. He no longer wished to persuade anyone that he had changed. He intended simply to live differently, whether Vivienne returned or not. At Rosemere House, Vivienne slowly discovered pieces of herself she believed had disappeared forever. She spent quiet mornings teaching children their letters. She walked through woodland paths with Charlotte, laughing over memories from girlhood that had once seemed impossibly distant. She accepted invitations to village concerts and charity gatherings without wondering whether someone preferred she remain absent. Gradually she realized something remarkable. Her happiness no longer depended upon whether William asked her to stand beside him. She already knew she belonged wherever kindness welcomed her. That realization brought peace rather than bitterness. One spring morning, a formal announcement reached both Ashford Manor and Rosemere House. Another grand gathering would be held at Ashford Manor to welcome distinguished guests from Parliament and several noble families. Charlotte glanced toward Vivienne after reading the notice. "Does it trouble you?" Vivienne considered the question honestly. "No," she answered. "Once it would have. Now it simply reminds me how much has changed." Meanwhile, preparations began once more within Ashford Manor. Servants hurried through polished corridors exactly as they had a year before. Flowers filled crystal vases, musicians tuned their instruments. Yet those who had served long enough sensed something entirely different. William no longer asked whether every guest had arrived. Instead, on the morning of the gathering, he asked only one question. "Has every member of this household been welcomed?" Thomas Mercer smiled quietly. "Yes, Your Grace." "Good," William replied. "Then we are nearly ready." As evening approached, elegant carriages rolled beneath the great entrance arch. Ladies descended in silk gowns, while gentlemen exchanged greetings beneath glowing lanterns. Inside, the orchestra waited. Parliament members gathered in the reception hall. Yet William remained standing near the great front doors instead of greeting his distinguished guests. The butler approached discreetly. "Your Grace, everyone is assembled." William looked toward the entrance. "Not everyone." "Shall I announce dinner?" "No." The butler hesitated. "The guests are waiting." William answered quietly enough that only the servants nearest him could hear. "We are waiting for my Duchess." The word spread through the entrance hall in astonished whispers. No one remembered a duke delaying such an important gathering for any reason. Minutes passed. Then the great front doors slowly opened. Vivienne stepped inside wearing the same pale blue gown she had quietly folded away 1 year earlier. It had been carefully altered, not because it no longer fit her figure, but because the woman wearing it now stood differently. She no longer carried herself like someone apologizing for occupying space. Every conversation stopped. William walked toward her, without hesitation. He did not glance nervously at his guests. He did not lower his voice. Before Parliament, London's highest society, and every servant who had witnessed the old pattern for years, he offered her his arm. "Allow me to present my wife," he said, with unmistakable pride, "the Duchess of Ashford." No applause followed. None was needed. The silence itself honoured the moment. Vivienne accepted his arm of her own free will. Together they crossed the entrance hall through the very front doors she had once believed were meant only for others. No servant guided her toward hidden corridors. No whispered request asked her to disappear. Guests bowed respectfully as she passed. Many realized only then that Ashford Manor finally appeared complete. Throughout the evening, William remained beside her, not from obligation but from quiet gratitude. When guests sought charitable advice, he invited them to speak with Vivienne. When they praised the beauty of the estate, he acknowledged the woman whose compassion had shaped its heart for so many years. Nothing about his manner suggested performance. He behaved simply as though the truth had at last become natural. Long after the final carriage departed, Ashford Manor grew quiet again. Moonlight stretched across the entrance hall where 12 months earlier Vivienne had walked away, carrying only a small travelling bag. She and William stood together before the great front doors, looking over the peaceful estate beyond. William reached gently for her hand, not to lead her, not to keep her from leaving, simply to walk beside her if she wished. Vivienne looked toward the servants' corridor hidden beyond the west passage. "Do you remember that night?" she asked softly. "Every day," William answered. She smiled with quiet warmth. "The woman who left Ashford Manor that evening never came home again." He lowered his eyes, understanding exactly what she meant. "She believed she belonged in the shadows," Vivian continued. "She believed love meant becoming smaller whenever someone asked." She turned toward him. But another woman returned. William met her gaze without speaking. "She knows her worth now," Vivian said. "She will never disappear to make life easier for anyone again." "Nor should she," he replied. For a moment, they simply stood together in the silence that once separated them and now gently united them. Then William leaned slightly closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay beside me." 4 simple words answered 12 years of quiet rejection. Vivian smiled, not because she finally had permission to remain, but because she no longer needed it. Together they stepped through the great front doors into the first light of morning, not as a duke leading his duchess, nor as a wife following her husband, but as two people who had